In 1137, Abbot Suger began to rebuild the Abbey Church of Saint-Denis. Suger was not content with the dark, bulky, haphazard style of Romanesque architecture. Suger wanted his church to be a graceful expression of geometric harmony, striving toward heaven, and flooded with miraculous light. Years later, the new church of Saint-Denis was revealed to the world. As Suger had wished, this new church was definitely unlike its Romanesque predecessors. Where Romanesque churches were short and thick, his new church was tall and elegant. Where Romanesque churches were dark and imposing, his new church was bright and inspiring. Suger called his new style of church modern. His critics called it Gothic. Now, when you hear the word Gothic, you probably think of the kids in high school. You know, the ones who wore a lot of black clothing and eyeliner and wrote depressing poetry of a questionable quality. 1,000 years ago, the word Gothic referred to the Goths, a group of Germanic barbarians who had invaded and looted much of the Western Roman Empire. When the people of the 12th century called Suger's new church Gothic, they meant it was unrefined, barbaric, non-Roman. Those critics were almost entirely wrong. First of all, Gothic churches showed incredible refinement. Second, they marked the apex achievement of medieval civilization. However, they were right about one thing. These churches certainly were not Roman. This is what makes Gothic architecture so fascinating. After centuries living in the shadow of Rome, trying to copy the marvels of the Roman Empire, Western Europe had finally come up with something new, something marvelous in its own right: the Gothic cathedral. There are three things that make Gothic architecture Gothic. First, the pointed arch. Second, the ribbed vault. And third, the flying buttress. These three elements come together in Gothic architecture, and the results change the world. The pointed arch makes all the rest of Gothic architecture possible. Its predecessor, the semicircular or Roman arch, had some severe limitations. These limitations have to do with what engineers call stress lines. A stress line is basically the direction in which an arch distributes the pressure above it. The stress lines of the semicircular arch are mostly horizontal. This meant that the weight above these arches was distributed to the sides of the arch, pushing against the walls on either side. This is why Romanesque churches had such thick walls and tiny windows. They needed all that bulk to support the weight of the roof pushing outwards. By contrast, the stress lines of the pointed arch are much more vertical. The weight above the pointed arch is mostly directed downward to the supporting pillars. This means that you no longer need big heavy walls to support the roof. This redirection of force from a horizontal to a more vertical plane is characteristic of the other elements of Gothic architecture. This is especially true of the ribbed vault. A vault is, essentially, an extended arch made of masonry, used to roof a building. In early vaulted churches, the base arch was the standard semicircular arch. The resulting barrel vaulting was very heavy, and its stress lines tended to push out the walls of the church. Romanesque architects had overcome this limitation through the use of groin vaulting, which redirected the weight of the vaulting to a few points, instead of having it spread across the entire wall. Later Romanesque architects were able to reduce the weight of the vault, and further focus the mass, through the use of ribbed vaulting. Ribbed vaulting essentially makes a web of strong arches or ribs, and then fills in the gaps between these ribs with lighter materials. And because all the weight rests on those rib arches, the pressure can be focused to a very small area. Gothic architects were able to further focus this weight by replacing the Romanesque semicircular arches with pointed arches. Since the pointed arch does a better job directing weight downward rather than sideways, the need for bulky Romanesque walls was greatly reduced. Instead of thick walls, Gothic churches needed only a few piers to hold up these massive ceilings. And since the rest of the walls no longer needed to support the whole ceiling, they could be filled with luminous stained glass windows. You can learn more about Gothic stained glass windows in our lesson on Gothic art. Before moving on, it is worth noting that, in England, rib vaulting got even more ambitious and intricate, resulting in a uniquely English style of rib vaulting called fan vaulting. Now, using rib vaulting to focus all the weight of the ceiling onto a few piers had an unfortunate side effect for Gothic architects. Try as they might to direct the weight of the roof downward with pointed arches and rib vaults, millions of pounds of vaulted ceiling could not help but push outward along its stress lines. Since the piers were no longer supported by massive walls, Gothic architects needed to come up with a new way to help these piers shoulder their huge burdens without falling over. The architect of Saint-Denis came up with a brilliant solution. He realized that the outward pressure on the wall was not universal. Instead, it was focused in a few areas. What if, instead of building big, thick Romanesque walls, he just gave the building a little extra support in these few areas? This was the birth of the flying buttress. The flying buttress supports the piers of Gothic cathedrals from outside of the building, right at the point where the stress lines push out. Flying buttresses take the huge horizontal force of the vaulting and redirect it vertically into the ground. This external skeleton allowed Gothic cathedrals to soar to heights unimagined by their Romanesque predecessors. And because it was a skeleton, it did not block the light, allowing Gothic cathedrals to maintain their massive windows and weightless quality. Now that we've seen the basic elements of a Gothic cathedral, let's look at some examples. See if you can identify the three main Gothic architectural features: pointed arches, rib vaulting, and the flying buttress. We shall start with Gothic cathedrals of France, where this movement got started. And then we'll take a look at how this architectural movement spread across Europe.
Chansons et accords, par plusieurs jours, matinés languissants, et puis après ma fée réjouissant, car j'ai l'amour de la belle loge encore. Son alliance, c'est ma fiance, son cœur est bien, bien le ciel. Fille de tristesse, vive l'ivresse, puisqu'un amour attend de bien, puisqu'un amour attend de bien. Quand je la veux servir et honorer, quand par écrive son nom décoré, quand je la vois et visite souvent, ses amis n'en font que murmurer, mais notre amour n'en sort loin durer. Autant au plus à n'importe le